The compulsion of the human. Post-human liberalism. In the contemporary critical humanities, the privileging of the human has become as suspect as every other sort of privilege. Human exceptionalism is viewed as of a piece with the exclusionary logics of racism and sexism. Far from being the uncircumventable horizon for emancipatory politics, humanism is denounced as integral to a logic of domination that proceeds from the subjugation of nature to the enslavement of all those deemed less than human. Speaking on behalf of what she calls the critical post-humanities, Rosie Braidotti writes, "Appeals to the human were always discriminatory. They create structural distinctions and inequalities among different categories of humans, let alone between humans and non-humans." It is easy to retort that this indictment of humanism follows from conflating the restrictive specification of the human as white, male, heterosexual, European, etc., with its generic despecification, the human as what Alain Badiou calls the voided animal, an exception that includes the unspecified part of everything, neither white nor black, neither male nor female, neither heterosexual nor homosexual, and so on. But the suggestion that universalization proceeds not by generalizing specific predicates, but by subtracting them, tends to fall on deaf ears in a theoretical context where the Nietzschean equation of universalization with domination continues to hold sway. Once the inference with exception to exclusion is made, an all-inclusive post-humanism supplants exclusionary humanism as the politically progressive optic consonant with the liberal ideal of inclusiveness that has become the humanities' critical lodestone. Here is Braidotti again. Post-human scholarship is contiguous and resonates with biogenetic and technologically mediated advanced capitalism. What prevents it from being just an epistemic form of accelerationism? The answer is affirmative ethics, and the political praxis is collective counter-actualization of the virtual. The barrier against the negative entropic frenzy of capitalist axiomatic is provided by the politics that ensue from the ethic of affirmation. The political starts with deacceleration, through the composition of transversal subject assemblages that actualize the unrealized or virtual potential of what Deleuze calls a missing people. In the old language, deaccelerate and contribute to the collective construction of social horizons of hope. Braidotti espouses Deleuze-Guattari's metaphysical definition of capitalism, according to which capitalist reterritorialization is the entropic residue of a primary deterritorialization synonymous with creative life, but because it jettisons the crux of Marx's analysis of capital as the moving contradiction seeking to extract ever-increasing magnitudes of surplus labor from ever-decreasing amounts of necessary labor, this yields an equally metaphysical anti-capitalism, wherein the premium on creative affirmation obviates the need to abolish the social form shoring up this moving contradiction, private property, class, wage labor, and so on. By the same token, because it shares with its accelerationist sibling Deleuze-Guattari's metaphysical premium on creativity over reactivity, Braidotti's post-humanism is critical only insofar as it seeks to palliate rather than to celebrate the social consequences of capitalist creative destruction. Braidotti's appeal to unrealized or virtual potential also jars with the Deleuzean commitments. Deleuze pits virtual and actual against Aristotle's potentiality and actuality, where the latter are equal halves of an equivocal being, the former constitute the unequal halves of a univocal being. Thus, where potentiality is not yet present, virtuality is unpresentable. This equivocation underwrites Braidotti's invocation of hope, in as yet unrealized but present potential, a hope which supplants the imperative to abolish the social relations shoring up the boundary between the presentable and the unpresentable. Because it is wholly immanent to capital, the counter-actualization of virtual potencies required by Braidotti's hope is effectively the cultivation of empowerment within existing social relations. Last but not least, it is not clear how a post-human ethics that has banished negativity the better to affirm the immanence of what is could recognize anything as missing, let alone a people. It seems telling that the categories in terms of which Berdodi identifies the missing, the indigenous, female, queer, otherwise enabled, and others, are identifications of the excluded acknowledged by capitalist neoliberalism, rather than indices of the unpresentable capable of destroying its logic of incorporation, subsumption, undervalue. What is missing for Berdodi is simply whatever is not yet included, and since capitalism has shown subverted bourgeois humanism by personifying things including corporations, the social horizon of hope for a people to come under capitalism reduces to the claim that the indigenous, feminist, queer, otherwise enabled, and so on are people just as much as things are. Thus, the logic of liberalism culminates with the ontological ratification of capitalism's personification of things and reification of people in the formal equivalents of human and non-human. The ideological corollary of this logic is an ethics of affirmation that not only masks but consolidates capital's subdivision of class into the ramifying fractures of race, gender, ethnicity, culture, and so on, but it is too easy to expose the conservative kernel beneath post-humanism's radical veneer. Counteracting it requires more than abstractly opposing the generic despecification of the human to its restrictive specification. What must be shown, rather, is how both this specification and despecification are conjoined in capitalism as a historically specific mode of social reproduction. With this aim in mind, I want to contrast two ways in which the subversion of the human proceeds from below and from above. I will focus particularly on the latter, in order to argue that the exception of the human, its status as an ontological anomaly, is constituted by an unhuman element whose twin facets are revealed in the Freudian concept of the drive and the Marxian concept of the commodity. The human exception is not due to any positive trait, but follows from a negative universality, the fact that humans are compelled to produce and reproduce the means of their social existence. Subversion from below. Humanism's subversion from below is straightforward. It consists in undermining any attempt to specify the difference between humans and other animals in terms of the capacity for language. The human is the talking animal, reason, the human is the rational animal, or politics, the human is the political animal. That language is a species of signaling, reasoning a species of reckoning, and politics a species of cooperation, reintegrates the differences that were taken to be constitutive of the human back into the continuum of biological capacities. The specificity of human difference reduces to specific capacities that humans share with other animals. But this renaturalization of the human assumes two very different forms in contemporary political discourse. Philosophical. In mainstream Anglo-American philosophy, it follows from acknowledging the evolved nature of the cognitive prowess as taken to be characteristically human. In Anglophone critical theory, by way of contrast, it proceeds from an animist metaphysics that conceives of all of nature as living. For instance, see Jane Bennett, Vibrant Matter, A Political Ecology of Things. See also Berdodi, who says, all matter or substance being one and immanent to itself, it is intelligent and self-organizing in both human and non-human organisms. Vital matter is driven by the ontological desire for the expression of its innermost freedom, conatus. Thus, we have two reductions of the human, one positivist, one animist. Although it is customary to contrast positivism to naturalism, I use the term here to characterize all those varieties of philosophical naturalism for which current science delimits the scope of knowledge and culture is continuous with nature. Animism is also a variety of naturalism, but one that proceeds from a straightforwardly metaphysical conception of nature. The contrast between positivism and animism is not between naturalism and anti-naturalism, but between scientific and speculative naturalism. Both concur in stipulating an underlying continuity between culture and nature. Where the positivist reduction seeks to explain how human-mindedness arises from mindless but scientifically tractable processes, the animist reduction rejects modern scientific reductionism and seeks instead to reunite culture and nature by attributing mindedness to everything. For those who embrace this second option, the ubiquity of mindedness, understood as sentience rather than sapience, follows from post-structuralism's decentering of the subject. The destitution of the subject as the I that is we and the we that is I, which lies at the heart of philosophical modernity as elaborated by Kant and Hegel, entails the dissolution of anthropocentrism and the inception of a postmodern animism from which anthropomorphism is no longer an error but an enabling commitment. Scientific naturalism is more audacious. It rejects anthropomorphism as well as anthropocentrism. Subjectivity is a cognitively tractable natural phenomenon. It is, for example, the embedding of a transparent self-model within a representational systems world model. Nevertheless, positivists and animists concur in rejecting Kant's claim that the knowing subject is neither a substance, a la Descartes, nor a bundle of experiences, a la Hume, but rather an epistemic function that cannot be located within the world whose experience it renders possible. Kant desubstantializes the subject by subtracting it from the reality which it conditions. By inscribing subjectivity within reality, both positivism and animism resubstantialize it. Animism does so directly by embracing panpsychism, understood as the claim that all things think. Positivism does so in a less direct, but ultimately no less metaphysical fashion, by reintegrating the scientific perspective into the reality it seeks to describe and explain. Science is not a view from nowhere, but a particular perspective on reality embodied by organisms with specific biological histories and cognitive defaults. By collapsing Kant's distinction between the causal ideology of knowledge and its normative justification, both positivism and animism relativize their own cognitive claims in a manner that oscillates between empiricist skepticism and metaphysical perspectivism. The skeptical tendency is exhibited in the pessimistic meta-induction and the claim that science can no longer lay claim to overarching unity. The perspectivist corollary is the suggestion that reality may have as many different facets as there are vocabularies for describing it. Both tendencies are discernible in recent philosophy of science. In either case, subjectivity is reified as both the conditioning of and conditioned by the reality it knows. Subversion from above. The metaphysical short circuit between conditioning and conditioned subjectivity is avoided by humanism's subversion from above. In a post-Kantian operation that seeks to evacuate the residue of substance in the transcendental subject, it does so by uncovering a conceptual keystone that correlates subject and object while de-reifying both. This is no longer a reinscription of the human from below, but a decentering from above that turns the human into the site of a difference more radical than any metaphysical difference. The human is no longer a different kind of being, but the site of a different kind of difference. But here again there are two distinct ways of characterizing this difference, as existence or as drive. In Heidegger's fundamental ontology, existence is not a specifiable property, but a Sein können, a pure potentiality to be. Humans are unlike other entities because their way of being is characterized by a structure of temporal projection in which the past, the present, and the future are not successive, but inseparable, yet unpresentable. This structure is the wellspring of temporal transcendence. Time, not eternity, is the source of transcendence, but one that is finite and human, as opposed to infinite and divine. The transcendence unfolds as the correlation of Dasein and Sein, existence and being. The source of this correlation lies in Dasein's pre-understanding of being, a pre-understanding rooted in its practical comportment toward things. Fundamental ontology is the interpretation of the pre-understanding of being implicit in practical comportment. This has two consequences. First, existence as transcendence unfolds within the bounds of sense. Second, Heidegger ontologizes sense while decoupling it from the senseless processes that shape practical comportment. Or rather, he subordinates the description and explanation of these senseless processes to the pre-understanding of sense. This idealist premium on sense is exacerbated by the later Heidegger's decoupling of being from existence or event from comportment. But the ontologization of sense cannot be countered simply by affirming the primacy of comportment, recoded as practice. Practices unfold within social forms that can be idealized as horizons of meaning or symptomatized as apparatuses of power. This alternative encapsulates the divide between post-Heideggerian pragmatism, which emphasizes the primacy of being in the world, and post-Nietzschean genealogy, which anatomizes the operations of power. But the more radical materialist counter to both the hermeneutics of sense and the metaphysics of power lies in the psychoanalytic concept of the drive, trieb. As compulsion to repeat, the drive is not just senseless, but the instance articulating sense and senselessness. Mladen Dolar lucidly expresses the way in which the concept of the drive subverts every familiar metaphysical opposition, whether between the one and the many, freedom and necessity, or culture and nature. He writes, "The drive, libido, is not a one, it is not a substance. It possesses the key quality of the drive by the very impossibility of being substantialized and totalized. Or in other words, we don't have two separate, independent, and opposed areas, such as nature and culture, neatly localized and delimited, which would come into conflict with always unsatisfactory outcome. Both nature and culture appear as non-all, not fully constituted, but held together by their impossible overlap, which is the drive. We cannot simply oppose two massive totalities of nature and culture, for the Freudian notion of the drive can be seen as the concept, the aim of which is ultimately to de-totalize the two, to undermine this very opposition and its self-evidence." On this psychoanalytic account, the exception of the human is not derived from the reflexive structure of existential transcendence, understood as the interpretation of understanding. The exception consists, rather, in the enigma of the drive as that which is prior to understanding but cannot be interpreted. As Jean Laplanche puts it, the psychoanalytic method, in its originary moment, works not with hermeneutic keys but with screwdrivers. It dismantles locks rather than opening them. Only thus, by breaking and entering, does it attempt to get at this terrible and laughable treasure of unconscious signifiers. Unconscious signification is the terrible and laughable obverse of ontological understanding. What is decisive here is the opposition between unconscious signification and implicit meaning. The drive at work in unconscious signification is neither the residue of nature and culture, of the object and the subject, nor the trace of culture and nature, of the subject and the object. It is this splitting itself, the disarticulation of the two. As such, the drive disrupts the consistency of nature understood as the domain of instinct, as well as the integrity of culture understood as the realm of the normative. In this regard, as Dolar emphasizes, the concept of the drive subverts the post-Kantian opposition between the normative and the natural, or between reasons and causes. In one sense, the drive is the missing link between freedom and nature. In another sense, it is the dissolution of both. It is neither human nor non-human, but both more or less than human, the unhuman core of the human. But the danger of ontologization remains, not the ontologization of sense through existential transcendence, but of the drive as an aboriginal bifurcation of culture and nature. To posit the drive as an aboriginal schism would be to posit it, as Hegel says, like a shot from a pistol. The split is mediated by its extremities. Although not from the order of either culture or nature, the drive cannot be wholly abstracted from them. De-reifying it requires supplementing the psychoanalytic account with an account of the reciprocal mediation of culture and nature, but one that is not predicated upon a humanist hermeneutics of sense or a post-humanist metaphysics of power, of life. Here lies the salience of Marx's historical materialism. Its key claim is that humans produce and reproduce the material conditions of their social existence. Thus, the difference that separates humans from other animals is neither metaphysical nor transcendental. Humans make the difference through the historically different forms in which they produce and reproduce their social existence. This is Marx's advance over metaphysical humanism. As Althusser points out, Marx's claim in his sixth thesis on Feuerbach that the human essence is not an abstraction inherent in the individual, but a historically variable ensemble of social relations, is not a definition, but a de-reification of the concept of the human. But Althusser's allergy to the Hegelian aspects of Marx's analysis of the commodity form blinds him to the significance as the mediating link between culture and nature. What is crucial is the twofold nature of the labor involved in commodity production. It is at once abstract and concrete. Both the exchange value of abstract labor and the use value of concrete labor are encompassed by the commodity form. since the dimension of use value does not exist independently of exchange value. Labor is exchanged abstractly, but used concretely. Because abstract, value-producing labor is inseparable from concrete use-producing labor. The commodity form mediates social reproduction while remaining utterly opaque to its practitioners. The commodification of production and exchange blinds producers and exchangers to the social relations and, more fundamentally, to the class relation, embedded in their acts of producing and exchanging. This socially necessary unconscious is entwined with the unconsciousness of the drive. The unconsciousness of the drive. The unhuman core of the human, or what is at once more and less than human, comprises both the compulsion of the drives and the compulsion extorted by the social forms necessarily occluded from experience. Thus, the unhuman is not only what compels us to repeat ourselves, it is also what drives us to reproduce ourselves without knowing that what we are doing makes us what we are. To recognize this is to recognize human history as a process that does not unfold linearly from an identifiable origin to a foreseeable end. Human history unfolds catastrophically, in a ceaselessly reiterated overturning of origin and end, driven by the twin pulses of libidinal repetition and social reproduction. This is the insistence of the unhuman at the core of the human. It is the insistence of this unhuman negativity that undetermines the metaphysical and anthropological determinations of the human. Negative universality. Thus the human is neither a metaphysical subject nor an anthropological attribute. It is the cipher for an undetermined determinability that cannot be rooted in the metaphysical difference between actuality and potentiality. Simon Skempton defines this as a negative and contentless universality, the overcoming of all specific determinacy. Thus, it is not the universalization of any determination. It is precisely the negative universality of being human that is estranged in money and exchange value. Thus, Marx writes, "The inversion and confusion of all human and natural qualities, the fraternization of impossibilities, this divine power of money lies in its being the externalized and self-externalizing genus being of man. It is the externalized capacities of humanity." Skempton glosses this as follows: "This alienation involves universal determinability taking the form of the spectrality of money and exchange value. For Marx, humanity's generic being is an insubstantial, unessential universality, not tied to specificity, which is the basis of its social relationality, but which is alienated from the individual through capitalist social relations and the division of labor, which in turn tie her to specific determinacy." The question is whether this universal determinability has become estranged, or whether it is retroactively generated through this estrangement. If humanity's generic being is insubstantial, unessential universality, then the alienation at issue cannot be that of generic determinable's estrangement in its specific determination, as when theologians describe human power and wisdom as limited manifestations of God's limitless power and wisdom. For in this case, the determinable's undeterminedness would be a subtraction from the determination of its species, and its negativity would follow from the negation of determination, not the negation of negation. In other words, its negativity would remain positively haloed by specific determinacy. It would be a relative rather than a self-relating negativity. But to endow humanity with a generic transformative potential that has become estranged in the course of actual history would be to construe this determinability as a distinct moment that pre-exists its self-estrangement. This would be to resubstantialize the human essence as an originary state prior to the process of social reproduction, and to construe negative universality as the defining property of the human. As I have shown, this is precisely Heidegger's characterization of existence as Seinkönnen, or pure potentiality to be. But the materialist twist consists in the claim that the negativity of this universality is not proper to the human, because self-estranging negativity manifests the impropriety or accidentality of the unhuman, upon which the determinability proper to the human depends. This is to say that the undetermined determinability ascribed to being human does not pre-exist its estrangement in the social forms of money and exchange. It becomes possible through them. The determinable is undetermined through its estrangement. Thus, the determinate does not precede its determination through negation and estrangement. It only acquires determinacy as a result of an estrangement that has already taken place, always already taken place. This is the subversive core of Hegel's logic of estrangement. The estrangement has already taken place. The distinction has been excluded from what is self-same and set to one side. What is supposed to be self-samedness is thus already one of the estranged moments, much more than it would ever be the absolute essence itself. That what is self-same estranges itself means that it, as what is already estranged, as otherness, likewise thereby sublates itself. Quote from Phenomenology of Spirit. Because what is supposed to be self-same is already one of the estranged moments, any potentiality harbored by it must be subsequent and not antecedent to its estrangement. Potentiality is determined ex post, not ex ante. What is materialist in Marx is the suggestion that the negative universality of human sociality becomes actual as a real, rather than merely ideal, possibility in and through the social forms that seem to negate it. Communism does not release social activity in order to recover an estranged essence, a transcendent potentiality reified in exchange value and subordinated to capital's self-valorization. Rather, communism perceives in the autotelic finality of money the estrangement of an estranging activity, which is social reproduction. Abstract labor is the appearance of an essence, human sociality, whose actuality it contradicts, yet this contradictoriness, and the political practice consequent upon it, provides the ground for refounding the actuality of sociality. What we see in abstract labor is the potentiality of our reproductive activity given tangible form and its sheer determinability. Abstract labor is a form assumed by reproductive activity, but it is not until it appears as estranged in the illusory autonomy of commodified labor power that this activity and the possibilities generated by our perceiving its estranged form become appropriable as our own. The compulsion of the human. Human history is generated by social reproduction and libidinal repetition, but it is also the deferential element within which reproduction and repetition occur. Recur, not recur. As such, history is not the linear accretion of determination, but a recurring loop through which reproduction and repetition jointly undetermine whatever has become actually determinable. This is why the human is not only mutable, but the source of a mutability that is sui generis. But where idealism rooted this mutability in self-consciousness, Marx and Freud tie it to the compulsions of reproduction and repetition, both of which operate behind the back of self-consciousness. The tremendous power of the negative that Hegel attributed to the pure I is rooted in a thing that is not any recognizably human subject or self, precisely because it is neither a monad nor a dyad. It is the unhuman offspring of repetition and reproduction. But it is precisely the error of idealism to view what is necessarily unconscious understood as that which is structurally incommensurable with conscious experience, as extrinsic or foreign to conceptual self-consciousness. Only by grasping its structural heteronomy, which is to say the constitutive role played by the unconscious within it, can self-consciousness, or what Hegel called a reason, comprehend itself and thereby satisfy its own conceptual compulsion. In other words, only by recognizing unhuman compulsion can humans be compelled to become free.